has lived, a gift has been given, and sometimes we get it a little confused on receiving that gift. Israel has. Israel has got confused on that. Eddie, you're going to have to help me there or move me, or you want me to keep talking? Won't go. Well, if we were to look up the word give in a concordance, so if you wanted to search the word give or a derivative of that word, give, given, have given, you would find that when the word is used, it mostly refers to God's gift of the promised land. Perhaps nowhere, especially in the Old Testament, in the first 6 books, is that mentioned more, that God has given Israel the land of Canaan. God gave this to the descendants of Abraham. Israel, given many things. They were given, you think about the things that God gave them, and especially in the wilderness, manna, quail, water, rest. The gifts mentioned most of all, again, is that gift of Canaan. See if that did sort of readable there. So when we think about where we're headed through Joshua, just understanding that this was a given, it was a gift that God gave them. And what were some of their struggles? First time they showed up to the edge of the promised land, what happened? Anybody remember? They had about 12 men, right? 12 men sent in to spy out the land, and they came back in fear. And so this gift that was given, the land was theirs, but they were fearful. When Israel was in the Egyptian bondage, God spoke to Moses and said, I will bring you into the land which I swore to give Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and I'll give it to you as an heritage. I am the Lord. So Exodus 6:8. So God has told Moses what he's going to do, why he's going to do it, who he made the promise to. He's going to give it. God told Moses to send 12 spies into the land of Canaan, that land that he was giving the children of Israel. And then in Leviticus as well, he said, he would say, I am giving this land to the children of Israel. So that's important to understand. And in Leviticus, most of the Levitical laws, although they dealt with many things, leprosy and other things, God would say, when you come into the land of Canaan, which I give you as a possession. So talking about enacting those laws, using those laws when they came into a land of promise. God always spoke of this as a gift. Never as earned possession, a fact that was an issue with Israel when they refused to go into the promised land for the first time. 40 years of wandering was the result of that fear. You think about it, the land was theirs. It was a gift that was given. They had to go possess it. And that possessing it was fearful. And so trying to make a parallel for us, do we have a gift that's given to us? All right, what's that gift? All right, it's a gift of Christ as well. So notice the things that Israel had to do to take possession of the gift that was given. And so there's oftentimes a lot of confusion when we move out of this Old Testament into a New Testament look of it, of receiving the gift. And so think about it. They had to prepare provisions. We see that in Joshua 1. They had to cross the river, Joshua 3. They had to march around the city of Jericho. They had to keep marching around it 6 times, and then the 7th day, 7 times. They had to blow trumpets to shout. They had to destroy all that was in Jericho. They had to battle with Ai. In fact, if I remember that right, I think they fought that one twice. Strike down the inhabitants of the southern part of Canaan. And there was a lot that Israel had to do to go possess the gift that God had given them. When we really look at this theme, that gift to Israel, his promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Moses are that central theme of the first 6 books of the Bible. Joshua 21:43 emphasizes the thoughts and actions. So Joshua would say, the Lord gave to Israel all the land of which he had sworn to give to their forefathers, and they, Israel, took possession of it. And so this idea of possession, God did not award the land to Israel because of some mighty work on their part. So as Christians, does the idea ever come in mind of earning something? I'm stuck again, Eddie. There it is. Does that idea ever come into mind? Have you ever thought or got in your mindset that you had to try to earn this gift that's been given to you? All right, got a few nods. I would think if we're all honest with ourselves, we, at certain times in our lives, at certain points, we may think that way. But there was nothing that Abraham did. In fact, you think about Abraham, where was Abraham when God called him? All right, what was Ur? Was it a Jewish, or there was no Jewish, but was it a God-fearing? All right, pagan, right? Pagan city. He's called out of a pagan city. Look back at Jacob, when Jacob and Rachel are running from her father, Laban. What is she going to carry with her? Idols, right? She stopped and stole her dad's household idols. And so there's a lot of struggles there. Did Israel deserve this land of milk and honey? No, not at all. There was nothing that they did. It was not a reward per se for what they had done. Although those patriarchs, those men, had followed and obeyed God. They had their ups and downs, but they were faithful to God. They did not purchase it from God with any kind of earned income. They did not earn the right to be there. God, who owns everything, gave it to them. It was free. Israel's acceptance of the gift did not exclude effort on their part. And so when we think about that, think about the spiritual side. And so Israel is called God's nation. Is there anything we can liken ourselves to with that today? All right, spiritual Israel, you might say, I think would be appropriate to say that. We are God's children today. We have been given a gift, that gift of Christ and of salvation. God's offered it to all who will take it, that spiritual promised land. You can go over and look at Revelation 22:17 or Titus 2, Matthew 11:28 through 30. But there's an idea that there's something we're doing to take possession of it. We're following, we're obeying, we're following those commands that he's given us. When it comes to the gift of salvation that God extends to the whole world, for God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, his only begotten Son, that whosoever shall believe in him shall or should have eternal life. This idea that God has offered to all mankind this gift, but there is something that man must do to be saved. And that's can be in the religious communities or religious world a foreign idea. So Acts 2:37, 2:38, they ask that question, do they not? What must we do? You look at the Philippian jailer. He asks that same question, what must I do to be saved? All right, and obviously a lot of people stop with the Philippian jailer and they told him, what'd they tell him? Anybody remember what they told him? That believe, all right, you must believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. Then they go on, they teach him, and he's baptized. Over in Acts 2, what's the response to Peter's message? Anybody remember what his, all right, they ask that question, and what does he tell them? Well, repent and what? Be baptized, right? And so there's within this story of Joshua is this receiving this gift. And I hope as we look at this story that we're going to see that it has a parallel with us, and that even for us, the work of salvation is done by God through Christ. It's a free gift offered to all, but there's an obligation to pick the package up, if you want to say, and to utilize that package, to do something with it. If not, God says that how will mankind, we mentioned that at 1:30, how will mankind be judged? What's going to be the earmarks, or what's going to be the identifier for God's people? All right, love. And love causes us to act. So we're going to be judged on what we've done in the body, whether good or evil. And we also, again, you go over to the sheep and the goats, and we've got one side, sheep side, that saw him hungry and naked and thirsty, and they did something about it. You've got another group that didn't do anything about it. And their argument is, when did we see you, Lord, that way? He said, well, you didn't do it. You didn't do it to the least of these. You didn't do it to me. And so not that that's a reward, but it is an obligation of obeying Christ. It is looking at his commands. Does that make sense? And that as we move through Joshua, I hope that will stay in the back of your mind, that they are receiving a gift that God has given them. And it's not because they're worthy, they didn't buy it, they didn't earn it, but they have to do something to receive it and to get it. And that parallels, so Joshua, the name Joshua itself means what? Anybody know what Joshua means? All right, God saves, yeah, Yahweh saves. You sort of go over in Yeshua or Jesus, what's that mean? All right, yeah, pretty much Joshua, it means salvation, right? So it's a likening to that. Now, we're headed to Jericho. Our story tonight is about Rahab. I just pulled this up. This is just sort of a drawing. Jericho's had a lot of excavations in it, or several excavations. This just happens to be a picture of an excavation map. There's a pretty good YouTube video if you want to go watch it. It's called the channel is called Expedition Bible, and they're digging, or they're going back over Catherine Canyon's excavation. They're sort of arguing her. She is the one that dated the pottery outside of the late Bronze Age of Joshua's time. So that's now more or less been dated to the correct time, or Joshua's time. And I know for everybody in here, there's no doubt and no misunderstanding, but they've dug it, and the walls fell outward, by the way. They found red mud bricks falling outward and a destruction layer there. Even Catherine Canyon would agree that they fell out, but she dated it to a different period. So a more modern, if you want to say, still a generated view of that, but you can see it's got two city walls around it, and that's what they've found by digging. And those outward and inward, those walls would come down. In our story tonight, it's important, if you can sort of see, you have to get over to the sort of the right side of that image, but you can see the houses that are in the wall or on the wall. And we know in our story tonight that we're told that Rahab lives on that outer wall of that city. And so those are just there just to give you maybe a visual reference of what Jericho might have looked like. I did have the fortune of going to Jericho, but we didn't go into the dig, but we sort of looked over into it, and it's just really today just a big hill, a tell they call it, but it's just a big pile of dirt. So, but they have excavated it through the years. And so tonight, predominantly, as we continue this, looking at a convert in Canaan. And so when you think about the story of Joshua, and if you want to open up to Joshua chapter 2, we'll start our look there. But we run into a lady that is in Jericho named Rahab. I don't know why I'm way past it. Rahab. And so looking at the story, and we're going to read this story. Read most of this chapter, and then we'll come back and talk about it. It says, and Joshua the son of Nun sent two men secretly just as spies, saying, go view the land, especially Jericho. And they went and came into the house of a prostitute whose name was Rahab, and lodged there. And it was told to the king of Jericho, behold, men of Israel have come here tonight to search out the land. And the king of Jericho sent to Rahab, saying, bring out the men who have come to you, who entered your house, for they have come to search out all the land. But the woman had taken the two men and hid them. And she said, True, the men came to me, but I did not know where they were from. And when the gate was about to close at dark, the men went out. I do not know where the men went. Pursue them quickly, for you will overtake them. But she had brought them up to the roof and hid them with the stalks of flax order on the roof. So the men pursued after them on the way to the Jordan as far as the fords, and the gate was shut as soon as the pursuers had gone out. Before the men lay down, she came up to them on the roof and said to the men, I know that the Lord has given you the land, and that the fear of the Lord has fallen upon us, and that all the inhabitants of the land melt away before you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the waters of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the two kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, to Sidon and Og, whom you devoted to destruction. And as soon as we heard it, our hearts melted, and there was no spirit left in any man because of you. For the Lord your God, he is God in the heavens above and on the earth beneath. And so we see Rahab, this named here as a prostitute. And so when you think about Rahab, so what two women are mentioned in Hebrews 11? Didn't know it was going to be a test tonight, did you? All right, Deborah? Don't think so, but I didn't read the whole every word of the whole chapter when I made sure we were right. All right, so there you go, Sarah and Rahab. And so we have two women. What are some key differences between these two women? All right, one was a prostitute, without a doubt. So we would say her morality was in great question. What about Sarah? All right. Yeah, she was the wife of the patriarch of the Hebrew nation. Yes, as far as we know, she laughed one time when God told her she's going to be pregnant. And I'm going to tell you, anybody that was the age of Sarah in this room and somebody said you're going to be pregnant, probably going to giggle a little bit, right? But as far as we know, a very righteous woman who, although may have had a little moment of faith doubting when she gave Hagar to her husband, but as far as we know, a very righteous woman. So Sarah, the wife of the founder of the Hebrew race, used her dedicated body to bring Isaac into the world. So if you think about Sarah, her body more or less dedicated, was given for that purpose, her to bring in Isaac, bring in this heir to Abraham that was going to ultimately bless the whole world. Rahab, an ungodly pagan worshiper, she sold her body for money. And so we've got these two different women that are in there. So humanly speaking, these women didn't have much in common, did they? Yes. Absolutely. He said she was drop dead beautiful. In fact, Abraham had to lie about who she was, right? Yeah. Yep. A woman of beauty, so beautiful that when she came in the land, Pharaoh wanted her in his harem or for his wife. So I don't know why every time I come close to having to cough when I teach. Hebrew word translated harlot. If we just had this Old Testament text, we might want to just whisk away her profession, because it also in the Hebrew, that word can mean innkeeper. But we've got what is said over in Hebrews and James, and I sort of looked at that and looked at the Greek there, and you can't get rid of what the Hebrew writer and what James said. In fact, you can look at the word. It's not pronounced pornea, but that's close. You can sort of look at the word and tell what it means. But a woman who sells her body for sexual uses, a prostitute, harlot, one who yields herself to defilement for the sake of gain. And there's just not a good definition. That's Vine's definition of that word, that Greek word. Also, it was a metaphor used of Babylon and Rome as well. So for idolatry. And so it's just not, in a physical sense, there's nothing in common. But when we swap over and we get to a spiritual sense, it's interesting to know that we have these two women who are in the hall of faith, and even more than that, there's just a few women, 4 or 5 women listed in Jesus' genealogy? I'd have to go back and look, but there's not many. In fact, it's very uncommon to put women in the genealogy, but we'll find Rahab in the genealogy of our Savior. And so I bring all this out to say, have you ever felt like you're unworthy? Have you ever done something that you said, man, I'm just not worthy? I've messed up. People will not accept me. Sometimes we can look at people in a very unbecoming light. We can judge them and put them somewhere, or we can just sort of set them over here. Well, they've done X. It's interesting to know that even in the sense of Hitler and Stalin and some of these people who have mass genocide, Christ still died for them. To my knowledge, they didn't accept that. But what have you done where you don't feel you're worthy? And if we're not careful, we're going to stick Rahab over there. She has come a long way from a pagan prostitute to being an ancestress in the lineage of Christ. And you might also argue Romans 5:20, but where sin abounds, grace did much more abound. So this woman who we look at and who we read about has some great faith, and we'll talk some more about that great faith. She had a courageous faith. So Hebrews 11:31 and James 2:5. When you read that, and we'll go over there to Hebrews 11:31, and read that, and we'll see about her faith. By faith, Rahab the prostitute did not perish with those who were disobedient, because she had given a friendly welcome to the spies. So a courageous faith. What did Rahab put on the line when she hid the spies? Life, without a doubt. She put her life on the line. What would the king of Jericho done if he'd have known what she did? He would have killed her. That would have been treason. But it's also interesting, if you think about it, when did Rahab develop her faith? When do you see that her faith was developed? Was it before or after she hid the spies? All right, before. So we see that she'd already made her mind up about who this God was. She didn't know this God, but she knew from the report that he was the one true God. Her gods, I would assume, had never done what the one true God had done for the Jews, and had brought them out of captivity across the Red Sea, was with them. They overcame some kings that they shouldn't have beat. Absolutely. Faith. Yeah. All right. So if you didn't hear David saying that faith is a process, and her process continued to grow, she saw that spies were true to their word. She and her household were saved, and she grew in her faith. In fact, we'll talk more about that a little bit in her walk. Paul's writing to the Thessalonians would say how they had turned to God from idols to serving a living and true God. 1 Thessalonians 1:9. She was different than the people of Samaria centuries later, who feared the Lord and served their own gods in 2 Kings. So it's very common, and I would argue that we can get into this too, is to worship anything and everything. Anything that can benefit us. That's what the people of old did. They worshiped God, but they also worshiped Baal, Molech. There's all kinds of different gods and their names that the Canaanites and Amorites and Hittites and et cetera had. They had high places. And so in 2 Kings, what you see is that Assyria has taken over that northern kingdom, and they've come in and mixed with those Jews that have been left, and they're setting up high places. And so they're not only worshiping Yahweh, the one true God, they're worshiping all kinds of gods. And so that is something that we as well have to be aware of. And so I threw this up here just to help us think about it. But idolatry today can take many forms, often reflecting the values and obsessions of a contemporary society. And I've got a few examples, and they're not exclusive. But when I think about what we worship, what I can worship, obviously material things, money that comes to mind. But what about celebrities? Many people idolize celebrities. There are people that run everywhere they go and want to be where they are, athletes, influencers. Anybody follow any influencers? I know one of you got to raise your hands. She's in the very back, by the way. Often following their lives obsessively on social media, emulating their lifestyles, right? We can worship celebrities. Materialism, the pursuit of wealth and possessions can become a form of idolatry where individuals prioritize material goods over relationships, values, and spiritual behaviors. So what is the American dream? All right, more money, right? Got a wife, 2.5 kids, and 2 Suburbans or 1 Suburban? Got a 2-car garage? Whatever that number may be today, that's what we call success. And there's no doubt about it. When we were raising our children, and we're still raising children. I think you always raise children, by the way. So any young parents, you never quit, by the way. You'll keep on doing that. But we want them to be successful, don't we? Yeah, we want to be successful. Every parent wants their children to have more or better than they had. But if we're not careful, what can we teach our children? What can we teach them is important. Yeah, material, right? Whatever it takes to get ahead. Whoever you got to step on. And it's visible when we start talking about money. It's one thing to be kind and loving when it doesn't cost you anything, isn't it? But when it costs you something, it's very difficult. And our children, they see how we respond in those situations. It's one thing to say it, it's another thing to do it. And it's difficult. We've been there. It's difficult. Technology. Some people may idolize technology and becoming overly dependent on devices, social media for validation and connection. You can become just tied into technology. One of the things that is of great concern today would be AI. If it makes you feel any better or any worse, some of that right there is AI. I hear a lot of preachers talking about AI, artificial intelligence. It will give you a great outline. I think the danger becomes when we rely on it to give us information and we believe that information. And we, instead of digging and thinking for ourselves, we just take what is given. Anybody in here use GPS or maps to get from point A to point B? Have you ever looked to see if you're really going to the right spot? Or do you just pull it up, hit the button, and start driving? There are places, there are 2 Savannahs, right? You type in Savannah, you might get Savannah, Georgia, right? Possible, but if you're in Tennessee, it'll probably give you the one closest to you. But I can remember when GPS technology first came out, I was with the phone company, and if you didn't look where you were going to go to the wrong spot. You had to make sure that where you at least had to have an idea of where you were going. Well, today that's not necessarily true. Ideologies. Here's one that I think is of prevailing issue for us, and I'm not saying that if you have a political allegiance or you have some ideology that you're an idol worshiper, but if we're not careful, we can worship an idea. We can worship a political affiliation. If you don't believe that, try to get a bipartisan agreement out of the House or the Senate or even the state. We're fortunate locally. I don't think that's a problem. But if you want to see people get tore up, I can even remember we've got some people who were members here who are not members here just because of some of our Facebook posts on political things. Again, I'm not beating everybody up about it, but we've got to be careful where individuals may prioritize their beliefs above empathy and understanding, and obviously the call to love one another. Self-image, we can become obsessed with how we look, what we have on, how we look in social media. You know, it's very interesting to me, especially with some of our younger women. Mainly, women are more visual with this than the guys, which is interesting because I think guys are more visual than women. But how do I look? I mean, you can take some girls. My daughter, don't want to beat her up, be one of them, but you just want to take 5 or 6 pictures, right? Because that one she's not going to like. Something about the way she looks she doesn't like. And again, I'm not saying that's wrong or she's wrong, but we can become obsessed with it. And so just threw some of those things out to say, can we be guilty of the same thing in our modern culture? We're not worshiping statues and idols on a high place. You get into the letter to the Corinthians, we're not worried about meat sacrificed to idols, right? That's not our problem. But can we have a problem with idolatry? In fact, the Bible would say that covetousness is idolatry, right? And that's where it starts, is in the heart. Amazing how God in His grace uses people we might think could never become His servants. So when we look at Rahab, one of the things I think is important to understand about Rahab is that God is using this woman. 1 Corinthians 1, 27, 29. But God has chosen the foolish things of the world to put to shame the wise, and God has chosen the weak things of the world to put to shame the things which are mighty, and the base things of the world, and the things which, I can't read my own thing, which are despised God had chosen, and the things which are not, to bring nothing to things that are, that no flesh should glory in His presence. Excuse me. And so we see God working in ways that we don't see possible. So think about one woman I can think about. Where would you put the woman at the well? Where would we categorize the woman at the well? How do we deal with divorced people? That wasn't rhetorical, but I'll let it be if you want it to. How do we treat divorced people? What would you do if the woman that was at the well sat down beside you? Yeah, we put them in different categories. I just think the beauty here with Rahab is God sees something in her, and she has a response to God that is important. And so I don't want to stay there too long, but just understanding that when people come to Christ, they can become new creations. And so obviously those who have been through difficult things, even when they have messed up themselves, when they repent, they come to Christ, they should be accepted. She had a confident faith. Faith is only as good as its object. What is your faith in? Is it in the material things? I mentioned in an earlier class that one of the problems with rich people, and by the way, in world standards, we're all rich, no matter where you stand or how much money you do or do not have. You've got a lot in comparison to the world. Where is your faith? In fact, the rich people oftentimes, that's the problem with Jesus talking about how hard it was a rich man to get into heaven, was that rich people think they can solve the problems themselves, right? I've got enough money, I can handle this, where those in poverty often have to rely on God to do it. What is the object of your faith? Saving faith involves the whole personality. The mind is instructed, the emotions are stirred, and the will, the acts basically are in obedience to God. So I've mentioned this a few times and want to sort of reemphasize it, but if you want to change someone's behavior, what do you have to change? All right? Their beliefs, right? Because what we believe affects what we think. What we think affects our emotions, and our emotions usually are what drives our actions. And so affecting, where is your faith? What do you have your faith in? Well, the last thing with Rahab that always seems to come up, and it's a valid question, but what did Rahab do to the king? What did she tell the king? Did she tell the king of Jericho the truth or a lie? All right, so we've got God's words putting this woman up here saying she has great faith. She's in the hall of faith. James is talking about her, but look at what she did. Proverbs 12:22, lying lips are abomination to the Lord, but those who deal truthfully are his delight. Revelations 21:8, right? We might say all liars, where do all liars go? Where do all liars end up? Well, the lake of fire. I won't use the other word. All right, so it's problematic for us. Yes. Absolutely. Absolutely he did. In fact, all these patriarchs had their ups and their downs. To my knowledge, only Joseph is talked about with nothing really negative. But just because God commends an individual for a righteous act does not mean that God approves of everything the person did. Jesus was the only perfect person who lived. Noah, Abraham, Moses, all those faithful still had their ups and downs. In fact, we look at Peter. Peter preaches this great sermon on the day of Pentecost. But Peter had some issues too, didn't he? He had some ups and downs. And David mentioned this. Rahab was a pagan woman in transition. So she practiced before abominations, but she would become this great woman of faith. In fact, her faith was great from the beginning when they were coming in. She heard who God was, and she believed God. She met the Jews. She helped the Jews. She ultimately lived, and she is one of the women that's in Christ's lineage. Rahab coupled her confessed belief, recorded in Joshua 2:9 through 11, with action. She courageously hid the spies. And so I'll leave you with this question. What about us? What will we courageously and confidently put our faith in? Where will our faith lie? And so I'll leave you with that thought. Thank y'all. Have a great night.